The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her communications equipment. She had been monitoring enemy drone activities for 3 months, watching patterns that others seemed to miss. Her fellow Marines often joked about her obsession with the small flying machines that appeared on their radar screens. They called them mosquitoes, annoying but harmless. Maria knew better. She had studied every drone attack report from the past year, noting how they moved, how they struck, and most importantly, how they seemed to learn from each encounter. While her commanding officers focused on larger threats, she quietly built a database of drone behaviors and weaknesses. The base sat on a strategic hill, overlooking 3 major supply routes. Intelligence reports suggested enemy forces were planning something big, but nobody could predict when or how it would happen. The Marines had been on high alert for weeks, checking every shadow and questioning every unusual sound. Maria's background made her different from the other soldiers. Before joining the Marines, she had worked as a software engineer, developing security systems for tech companies. Her analytical mind saw patterns where others saw chaos. She understood how automated systems worked, how they could be fooled, and how they could be destroyed. Her squad leader, Sergeant Thompson, respected her technical knowledge but worried about her tendency to work alone. He often found her in the communications center long after her shift ended, studying radar data and signal patterns. Other Marines would be playing cards or writing letters home, but Maria remained focused on the screens, searching for clues. The other soldiers didn't understand her dedication. Some thought she was trying to impress the officers. Others believed she was paranoid about technology taking over warfare. A few respected her knowledge but questioned whether her theories would work in real combat situations. Maria had tried explaining her concerns to higher-ranking officers several times. She warned them about coordinated drone swarms and their potential to overwhelm traditional defenses. Most listened politely but dismissed her warnings as speculation from someone who spent too much time reading technical manuals instead of focusing on conventional threats. The base's defense systems were designed for larger aircraft and ground vehicles. Anti-aircraft guns could handle helicopters and jets, but they moved too slowly to track small, fast drones. Missile systems were expensive to use against cheap targets. The military doctrine hadn't caught up with the reality of modern asymmetric warfare. Late one evening, while analyzing the latest intelligence reports, Maria noticed something troubling. Enemy communications had increased dramatically over the past few days, but the messages were encrypted in a way she hadn't seen before. The patterns suggested coordination between multiple groups, all focused on their location. She brought her findings to Captain Williams, the base intelligence officer. He reviewed her data with interest but explained that higher command was more concerned about conventional ground attacks. Drone threats were considered secondary priorities, handled by specialized units that weren't stationed at their base. Maria felt frustrated but not defeated. She had learned to trust her instincts during her years in technology, and those same instincts were screaming warnings now. She decided to take unofficial action, using her technical skills to modify some of the base's equipment. If her superiors wouldn't listen to her warnings, she would prepare her own defenses. Working during her off hours, she began experimenting with signal jamming techniques and electronic countermeasures. She studied the base's power grid, communication systems, and defensive positions, looking for vulnerabilities that drone swarms might exploit. Her preparations were careful and methodical, guided by years of experience in system security. Other Marines noticed her unusual activities but assumed she was working on some special project for the officers. Maria didn't correct their assumptions. She preferred to work quietly, knowing that explaining her unauthorized preparations might get her in trouble with command. As days passed, the tension at the base increased. Patrols reported unusual activity in the surrounding areas, and intelligence updates suggested enemy forces were moving closer. Everyone expected a traditional attack, with vehicles and infantry approaching from predictable directions. Maria continued her preparations, hoping she was wrong about the drone threat but knowing she couldn't ignore the evidence. She had identified the most likely approach routes for aerial attacks and calculated how long the base's defenses could hold against different types of assaults. Her analysis painted a grim picture that she hoped she would never need to use. The attack began at dawn with a sound Maria had never heard before. It wasn't the roar of jet engines or the rumble of tanks. Instead, a low humming filled the air, like 1,000 angry bees approaching from multiple directions. She grabbed her binoculars and rushed to the observation post, her heart racing as she confirmed her worst fears. Hundreds of small drones filled the sky, moving in perfect formation toward the base. They flew at different altitudes and speeds, making them impossible to track with conventional radar systems. The morning light glinted off their metallic surfaces as they approached like a dark cloud of death. The base's alarm system erupted with warnings as other soldiers spotted the incoming threat. Marines ran to their positions, grabbing weapons designed for human enemies, not flying machines. The anti-aircraft guns turned skyward but struggled to target such small, fast-moving objects. Sergeant Thompson shouted orders over the chaos, trying to coordinate a defense against an enemy they had never trained to fight. Traditional military tactics seemed useless against the swarm of mechanical attackers. Rifle fire proved ineffective, and the larger weapons couldn't track targets moving so quickly and unpredictably. Maria watched in horror as the first wave of drones reached the base perimeter. They moved with intelligence, dividing into smaller groups to attack different targets simultaneously. Some headed for the communications center, others toward the armory, and a third group aimed for the command building where the senior officers were trying to coordinate their response. The drones carried various payloads, from explosive charges to electronic warfare devices designed to disrupt communications and power systems. They struck with precision, hitting exactly the targets that would cause maximum damage to the base's operational capabilities. It was clear that whoever controlled them understood military vulnerabilities perfectly. Captain Williams tried to call for air support, but the communication systems had been damaged in the first minutes of the attack. The base's power grid flickered as drones targeted electrical infrastructure with electromagnetic pulse devices. Within minutes, the Marines found themselves fighting blind and deaf, cut off from higher command and unable to coordinate their defense effectively. Maria realized that her unofficial preparations might be the base's only hope. She had studied these machines for months, learning their weaknesses and developing countermeasures that the official military doctrine ignored. While other Marines fired uselessly into the sky, she ran toward the equipment she had secretly modified. The drone swarm seemed endless, with new waves arriving every few minutes. They attacked in coordinated patterns, drawing defensive fire away from their primary targets before striking from unexpected angles. The mechanical precision of their assault made it clear that this wasn't a random attack, but a carefully planned operation designed to neutralize the base completely. Marine casualties mounted as soldiers tried to use conventional weapons against unconventional enemies. The drones were too small for rocket-propelled grenades, too fast for machine gun targeting, and too numerous for individual rifle fire to make any significant impact. The base's defenses had been designed for a different kind of war. Sergeant Thompson watched his men fall back from position after position as the drones systematically destroyed their defensive capabilities. The armory took a direct hit, eliminating their ammunition reserves. The motor pool burned as fuel tanks exploded under drone attack. The medical facility went dark as its power systems failed. Maria reached her modified equipment as the fourth wave of drones approached the communications center. She had spent weeks preparing electronic countermeasures, studying frequency patterns and developing jamming techniques that could disrupt drone control signals. Her hands moved quickly across the improvised controls as explosions echoed around the base. The other Marines didn't understand what she was doing, but they could see the determination in her actions. While they had given up hope of stopping the mechanical assault, Maria worked with the focused intensity of someone who refused to accept defeat. Her technical knowledge had prepared her for this moment, even though she had hoped it would never come. As the drones pressed their attack, systematically destroying everything the Marines had built and defended, Maria activated her countermeasures. The fate of everyone on the base now depended on modifications she had made in secret, using knowledge that traditional military training had never taught her. The humming of the drone swarm grew louder as they prepared for their final assault. Maria knew she had only one chance to prove that her months of preparation and warnings had been worth something. The battle for the base had become a contest between human ingenuity and mechanical precision, with survival hanging in the balance. Captain Williams made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Standing in the burning remains of the command center, surrounded by wounded Marines, and watching his base crumble under the relentless drone assault, he reached for the white flag. The communication systems were dead, ammunition was running low, and medical supplies were buried under rubble. The drone attacks had been more devastating than anyone could have imagined. In less than 2 hours, the enemy had systematically destroyed every major defensive position on the base. The Marines had fought bravely, but their weapons and training had proven useless against an enemy that attacked from above with mechanical precision and overwhelming numbers. Sergeant Thompson protested the surrender decision, arguing that they should fight until the last man. Other Marines echoed his sentiment, believing that giving up went against everything they had been taught about honor and duty. But Williams had seen enough warfare to recognize a hopeless situation when faced with one. The casualties were mounting by the minute. Marine after Marine had been wounded or killed trying to shoot down drones with weapons designed for ground combat. The medical facility was destroyed, leaving injured soldiers without proper care. The captain knew that continuing the fight would only result in more unnecessary deaths. Williams ordered the white flag raised from the highest point still standing on the base. The traditional symbol of surrender fluttered in the morning breeze as drones continued their systematic destruction of military equipment. He hoped the enemy controllers would recognize the gesture and cease their attack before more Marines died. The drone swarm seemed to acknowledge the surrender, pulling back from direct attacks on personnel while continuing to destroy vehicles and equipment. The mechanical precision of their response suggested that human operators were indeed controlling the assault, not just automated programming. Someone was watching and making decisions based on the battlefield situation. Maria watched the surrender proceedings from her position near the communications equipment, feeling a mixture of anger and determination. She had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario, developing countermeasures that could potentially turn the tide of the battle. The white flag represented giving up without trying her solutions. Other Marines began laying down their weapons and gathering in designated areas as the surrender process continued. Some looked relieved that the shooting had stopped, while others appeared angry about abandoning their positions. The professional soldiers struggled with the concept of surrender, having been trained to fight until victory or death. The drone operators seemed content to accept the surrender while continuing to destroy military hardware. Explosions echoed across the base as ammunition stores and fuel depots were systematically eliminated. The enemy wanted to ensure that even if they released the prisoners, the base would never again pose a military threat. Captain Williams tried to establish communication with the drone operators using hand signals and loudspeaker announcements. He hoped to negotiate terms for the safe evacuation of wounded Marines and the protection of surrendering personnel. Military protocol provided guidelines for surrender situations, though none had anticipated this type of technological warfare. Maria realized that she might be the only person on the base who still had options. Her modified equipment remained operational, hidden from the main areas where drones had focused their attacks. The countermeasures she had developed specifically targeted the control frequencies used by drone swarms, potentially disrupting their coordination and effectiveness. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on her mind. Her commanding officers had made a legitimate decision to surrender in order to save lives. Continuing to fight after surrender could be considered a violation of military law and international warfare conventions. But she also knew that her countermeasures might represent the only hope for survival. As she watched her fellow Marines comply with surrender orders, Maria made her own decision. She had sworn an oath to protect her country and her fellow soldiers. The technical knowledge she possessed came with a responsibility to use it when lives were at stake, regardless of formal command decisions. The drones maintained their positions around the base, clearly ready to resume their attack if the Marines showed any sign of renewed resistance. Their hovering presence served as a constant reminder that the enemy maintained complete control over the situation. The mechanical sounds of their engines created an ominous backdrop to the surrender proceedings. Maria checked her equipment one final time, ensuring that all her modifications were ready for activation. She had studied the drone frequencies for months, identifying vulnerabilities in their communication protocols that could be exploited with the right electronic countermeasures. Her engineering background had taught her that every system had weaknesses. The moment of truth was approaching. While her fellow Marines accepted defeat and prepared for capture, Maria prepared to challenge the seemingly invincible drone swarm with nothing but her technical knowledge and determination. She knew that her actions might be seen as insubordination, but she also knew that sometimes individual initiative was the only thing standing between victory and disaster. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she activated her improvised electronic warfare system. Months of secret preparation had led to this moment, when she would either save her fellow Marines or confirm that her theories were worthless against real-world combat conditions. The modified radio equipment hummed to life, sending targeted signals toward the drone swarm hovering above the surrendering base. Her first attempt targeted the primary communication frequencies she had identified through weeks of signal analysis. The electronic countermeasures were designed to disrupt the control links between the drones and their operators, creating confusion in their coordination patterns. She watched through binoculars as several drones in the nearest formation began flying erratic patterns. The effect was immediate, but limited. About a dozen drones lost their precise formation and started flying in circles or hovering motionlessly. However, the majority of the swarm continued their systematic destruction of base equipment, apparently operating on backup frequencies or autonomous programming that her initial countermeasures couldn't reach. Maria quickly adjusted her approach, switching to different frequency ranges and signal patterns. Her engineering background had taught her that complex systems usually had multiple layers of control and communication. She needed to find the right combination of disruption techniques to affect the entire swarm simultaneously. The drones that had been disrupted by her first attempt began recovering, suggesting that their operators were adapting to her countermeasures in real time. This confirmed her suspicion that human controllers were actively managing the attack, rather than relying solely on pre-programmed instructions. The enemy was learning from her actions just as she was learning from theirs. Sergeant Thompson noticed the unusual behavior of some drones and looked around for the source of the disruption. He spotted Maria working frantically with equipment he didn't recognize, her face illuminated by the glow of improvised control panels. Understanding dawned on him as he realized what she was attempting to accomplish. The other Marines remained focused on the surrender procedures, following Captain Williams's orders to lay down weapons and gather in designated areas. They were unaware that one of their own was still fighting the battle using methods that traditional military training had never covered. Maria's solitary struggle represented a last desperate attempt to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Maria's second wave of countermeasures proved more effective. She had identified what appeared to be a secondary control network, used for coordination between different drone groups. By jamming these signals, she caused larger sections of the swarm to lose their precise formation and targeting capability. Nearly 50 drones began exhibiting confused behavior, some flying into each other while others descended toward the ground in uncontrolled spirals. The systematic destruction of base equipment slowed as the affected drones lost their ability to coordinate attacks. Maria felt a surge of hope as her months of theoretical work began producing tangible results. However, the drone operators quickly adapted to her new countermeasures. The unaffected portions of the swarm regrouped and began attacking with renewed intensity, as if the controllers were rushing to complete their mission before losing more units. Explosions erupted across the base as the remaining drones accelerated their destruction of military equipment. Maria realized that she was engaged in a technological arms race with an enemy who could adapt as quickly as she could develop new countermeasures. Every success she achieved was temporary, lasting only until the drone operators identified and compensated for her interference. She needed a more comprehensive solution that would affect the entire swarm. Simultaneously, her analysis of the drone communication patterns had revealed what appeared to be a master control frequency used for overall coordination of the swarm. This signal was heavily encrypted and well protected, but Maria had identified potential vulnerabilities in its transmission patterns. Attacking this frequency would be risky because failure might alert the operators to strengthen their defenses. The situation on the base continued to deteriorate as the remaining functional drones pressed their attack. Several Marines had been wounded by debris from exploding equipment, and the medical facilities remained destroyed. Captain Williams watched helplessly as his decision to surrender failed to stop the systematic annihilation of everything his unit had worked to protect. Maria made the decision to attempt her most ambitious countermeasure. She reconfigured her equipment to generate a broad-spectrum jamming signal designed to disrupt the master control frequency. This approach would use all her available power and reveal the full extent of her capabilities to the enemy operators. As she prepared to activate the final countermeasure, Maria knew that this would be her last opportunity to affect the battle's outcome. Success might save the base and prove that individual initiative could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Failure would confirm that the age of human soldiers was ending, replaced by mechanical warfare that traditional military forces couldn't match. The drone swarm continued its methodical destruction, unaware that one determined Marine was about to challenge their technological superiority, with nothing but modified radio equipment and months of careful preparation. The next few minutes would determine whether human ingenuity could triumph over mechanical precision. The moment Maria activated her final countermeasure, the entire character of the battle transformed. Her broad-spectrum jamming signal struck the drone swarm's master control frequency like a digital lightning bolt, causing immediate chaos throughout their coordinated formations. What had been a precisely orchestrated mechanical assault suddenly became a confused mass of flying machines without unified direction. The effect was more dramatic than Maria had dared to hope. Hundreds of drones simultaneously lost their coordination, some hovering motionlessly while others flew in random directions. Several collided with each other, creating spectacular explosions as their payload detonated. The systematic destruction of base equipment ceased as the mechanical attackers struggled to maintain basic flight control. Captain Williams watched in amazement as the seemingly invincible drone swarm began falling apart before his eyes. Marines who had been preparing for capture suddenly found themselves witnessing the technological equivalent of a miracle. The white flag still flew above the base, but the enemy that had forced their surrender was no longer capable of enforcing it. Maria maintained her jamming signal while monitoring the drone's behavior patterns. Her equipment was operating at maximum power, generating heat that made the control panels almost too hot to touch. She knew that this level of power consumption couldn't be sustained indefinitely, but she hoped it would last long enough to neutralize the entire swarm. The drone operators were clearly attempting to regain control of their machines, sending new commands and trying different frequencies to re-establish communication. However, Maria's broad-spectrum approach was disrupting multiple control channels simultaneously, creating a communications blackout that affected the entire swarm's operational capability. Some drones began crashing into the base buildings as their flight control systems failed completely. Others flew off in random directions, disappearing over the horizon as their navigation systems lost connection with Central Command. A few managed to maintain basic hovering capability, but lost all targeting and coordination functions. Sergeant Thompson realized what was happening and began shouting orders to his Marines. The enemy's technological advantage had been neutralized, creating an opportunity to turn the tables on attackers who no longer possessed overwhelming superiority. Marines grabbed their weapons and prepared to defend their base against an enemy that was suddenly vulnerable. The psychological impact of the drone failures was immediate and powerful. Marines who had felt helpless against an unstoppable technological force suddenly found themselves facing confused machines that posed no coordinated threat. The restoration of hope was almost as important as the tactical advantage Maria had created. Maria's equipment began showing signs of strain as she pushed the power levels beyond safe operating limits. Smoke rose from several components and warning lights indicated that critical systems were overheating. She knew that her improvised countermeasures couldn't maintain this level of performance much longer without suffering permanent damage. The remaining functional drones were attempting to retreat, apparently receiving emergency commands to withdraw from the engagement. However, many were flying erratically or in circles, their navigation systems still disrupted by Maria's jamming signals. The coordinated swarm had become a scattered collection of confused individual machines. Captain Williams faced a critical decision. The enemy had been neutralized, but technically his unit had already surrendered. Military protocol provided little guidance for situations where surrender became unnecessary due to changed battlefield conditions. He had to choose between maintaining his surrender or resuming combat operations. Maria continued operating her countermeasures despite increasing equipment failures. Several control panels had shut down due to overheating, and the main power supply was fluctuating dangerously. She estimated that she could maintain jamming for perhaps 10 more minutes before her improvised System suffered complete failure. The drone retreat was becoming more pronounced as individual machines managed to break free from the jamming effects and receive withdrawal orders. However, many were too damaged or confused to execute coordinated movements. Some crashed while attempting to gain altitude, while others flew into obstacles as their sensors failed. Marine morale surged as they watched their technological tormentors fleeing in disarray. Soldiers who had been preparing for capture began cheering and celebrating their unexpected reversal of fortune. The impossible had happened through the efforts of one determined Marine who had refused to accept defeat. Maria's modifications had proven that human ingenuity could overcome technological superiority when applied with sufficient knowledge and determination. Her months of secret preparation had created the miracle that traditional military doctrine said was impossible. One person with the right skills had neutralized an enemy that an entire base couldn't defeat with conventional weapons. The battle was turning, but Maria knew that her victory was temporary. The enemy would learn from this encounter and develop countermeasures against her techniques. Future drone swarms would be better protected against electronic warfare. However, for now, her fellow Marines had a chance to survive and fight another day. The aftermath of Maria's electronic victory created chaos on multiple levels. Her jamming equipment finally succumbed to overheating, shutting down in a shower of sparks and smoke, but not before achieving its purpose. The drone swarm had been scattered to the winds, with most machines either crashed, destroyed, or fled beyond the horizon in complete disarray. Captain Williams stood among the wreckage of his base, trying to comprehend what had just transpired. The surrender he had ordered was now meaningless, but the tactical situation remained complex. His communications were still down, making it impossible to report the miraculous reversal to higher command. The base was damaged but defensible, and his Marines were alive but confused about their status. Maria collapsed beside her smoking equipment, exhausted from hours of intense concentration and the stress of single-handedly changing the battle's outcome. Her fellow Marines gathered around her, finally understanding that she had been the architect of their salvation. The soldier they had once dismissed as obsessed with technology had proven to be their most valuable asset. The immediate priority was assessing casualties and damage. While the drone attack had been devastating to equipment and infrastructure, Marine casualties were surprisingly light. Maria's countermeasures had disrupted the swarm before they could complete their systematic destruction of personnel areas. Most wounded Marines had suffered injuries from debris and explosions rather than direct attacks. Sergeant Thompson organized recovery teams to search for salvageable equipment and establish defensive positions in case the enemy attempted a follow-up attack. The base's defensive capabilities had been severely compromised, but the Marines still possessed their weapons and the determination to use them. The psychological boost from their unexpected victory had restored their fighting spirit. Maria's technical knowledge became invaluable during the recovery process. She helped identify which systems might be repairable and which were beyond salvage. Her understanding of electronic warfare also allowed her to assess whether the enemy might still be monitoring their activities through surviving surveillance equipment. The base's power grid had been partially restored, allowing limited communications capability. Captain Williams managed to establish contact with regional command, reporting the drone attack and the subsequent neutralization of the enemy force. The response from headquarters was initially disbelief, followed by urgent demands for detailed information about the countermeasures that had proven effective. Military intelligence officers arrived within hours, eager to debrief Maria about her electronic warfare techniques. Her improvised countermeasures represented a breakthrough in dealing with drone swarms, something that military research units had been struggling to achieve for months. The modifications she had made in secret were suddenly of national strategic importance. Maria found herself thrust into an unfamiliar role as a tactical innovator and technical expert. Officers who had previously dismissed her warnings about drone threats now hung on every word of her analysis. The months of solitary preparation and ignored warnings had transformed her from an overlooked soldier into a military asset. The broader implications of the battle began to emerge as intelligence analysts studied the wreckage of destroyed drones. The enemy had employed sophisticated technology that represented a significant advancement in autonomous warfare capabilities. Maria's successful countermeasures had not only saved her base, but it also provided crucial intelligence about enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities. However, Maria understood that her victory was just the beginning of a larger technological arms race. The enemy would analyze their failure and develop improved drone systems that were resistant to her countermeasures. Future battles would require constant innovation and adaptation, with electronic warfare becoming as important as traditional military skills. The base began receiving reinforcements and equipment replacements, transforming from a damaged outpost into a center for electronic warfare research and development. Maria's improvised countermeasures became the foundation for new military doctrines designed to combat drone threats. Her personal initiative had influenced military strategy at the highest levels. Recognition for her actions came in various forms, from commendations and promotions to requests for her expertise from other military units facing similar threats. However, Maria remained focused on the technical challenges ahead, knowing that her enemies were already working to overcome the advantages she had created. The Marines who had served with her during the battle developed a new appreciation for the importance of technical knowledge in modern warfare. The days when military success depended solely on firepower and courage were ending, replaced by an era where electronic capabilities could be more decisive than traditional weapons. The base that had nearly fallen to technological superiority had become a symbol of how human ingenuity could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Maria's refusal to accept defeat had not only saved lives, but had also changed the nature of military doctrine for future conflicts. 6 months later, Maria stood before a congressional committee tasked with modernizing military doctrine for the digital age. The small conference room was filled with senior military officers, defense contractors, and politicians eager to understand how one Marine had accomplished what entire research teams had failed to achieve. Her testimony would influence billion-dollar defense budgets and reshape how America prepared for future conflicts. The battle at the base had become a case study taught at military academies worldwide. Maria's improvised countermeasures had been refined and incorporated into official military systems, creating new defensive capabilities against drone swarms. However, she cautioned the committee that technological solutions alone wouldn't be sufficient for future security challenges. Her warnings about the evolving nature of warfare had proven prophetic. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were developing more sophisticated autonomous weapon systems, learning from their defeat at Maria's base. The technological arms race she had predicted was accelerating, with both sides constantly developing new capabilities to counter their opponents' innovations. The Marines who had served with her during the drone attack had been dispersed to various units, carrying their experiences and lessons to new assignments. Sergeant Thompson had been promoted and now led a specialized electronic warfare unit. Captain Williams commanded a research facility developing next-generation countermeasures. The battle had transformed all their careers and perspectives on modern military service. Maria's technical expertise had earned her a position at the Pentagon, where she worked with teams of scientists and engineers to anticipate future threats. Her unique combination of military experience and technical knowledge made her invaluable for developing strategies that could bridge the gap between theoretical research and battlefield reality. The base where she had made her stand had been rebuilt as a training center for electronic warfare specialists. Young soldiers learned to operate the same type of countermeasures that Maria had improvised during the battle. However, she emphasized that equipment alone wasn't sufficient without the analytical thinking and determination that had made her victory possible. Recognition for her achievements had come from the highest levels of government, including medals, promotions, and speaking opportunities at international conferences. However, Maria remained focused on the future challenges that would require similar innovation and courage. She knew that her victory had been just one battle in a much larger technological war. The drone technology that had nearly destroyed her base continued to evolve and proliferate. Nations and terrorist organizations around the world were developing their own swarm capabilities, creating threats that traditional military forces struggled to counter. Maria's countermeasures had provided temporary advantages, but the enemy was already developing ways to overcome them. She often reflected on the morning when her fellow Marines had raised the white flag, believing their situation was hopeless. The surrender had seemed logical and necessary based on conventional military thinking. But Maria's refusal to accept defeat had changed everything. Individual initiative and technical knowledge had proven more valuable than traditional firepower and numerical superiority. The lessons from her experience extended beyond military applications. Technology companies, cybersecurity firms, and research institutions sought her expertise for developing defensive systems against autonomous threats. The principles she had applied to defeating drone swarms were relevant to protecting critical infrastructure from various forms of technological attack. Maria's story had become an inspiration for a new generation of soldiers who understood that future battles would be fought with keyboards and signal processors as much as rifles and artillery. Military recruitment emphasized the importance of technical skills, and training programs incorporated electronic warfare alongside traditional combat techniques. However, she never forgot the human cost of technological warfare. The Marines who had been wounded during the drone attack, the fear in her fellow soldiers' eyes as they faced an incomprehensible enemy, and the weight of responsibility that came with possessing critical knowledge in life-or-death situations remained vivid memories that shaped her continued service. The committee members, listening to her testimony, represented the challenge of preparing for an uncertain future. Technology was advancing faster than military doctrine could adapt, creating gaps that enemies would exploit. Maria's experience demonstrated that victory often belonged to those who could think creatively under pressure, rather than those who simply followed established procedures. As she concluded her testimony, Maria emphasized that her success had depended on months of preparation, technical knowledge, and the determination to act when action seemed impossible. The next generation of military leaders would need similar qualities, along with the flexibility to adapt their thinking as new threats emerged. The battle against the drone swarm had ended with her countermeasures, but the larger war between human ingenuity and technological challenge continued every day. Maria Rodriguez had proven that individual determination could overcome overwhelming odds, but she also knew that future victories would require continued innovation, courage, and the wisdom to prepare for threats that hadn't yet been imagined.